We saw Xavier Worthy come out at the end of last season, kind of playing the Rashee Rice role.
Right.
So how does it work now? Because that was also in Xavier Worthy's collegiate profile, where he kind of won more as like, ooh, how are these guys going to play together? What is going on, Sharp Football family? It is your resident Swami of Konami, Rich Hribar. Today, I am joined by the true alpha target in the fantasy space, the paterfamilias of wide receiver knowledge. You know him from Reception Perception and Yahoo. He is the great Matt Harmon. You can head over to Reception Perception. Matt has already broke down the entire rookie class as prospects. He's doing a lot of year two wide receivers. He's done everyone that basically had a significant move in free agency. I would just actually implore you to go check out everything that he's already done. We covered the fallout of the George Pickens trade with some ancillary DK Metcalf conversation. But our original plan was to talk post-draft about some of the tougher wide receiver units to diagnose from like a usage stance or putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And we've seen the reflection of some of these teams also through fantasy ADP, opening ADP of a gamer saying, I don't know what to do with these guys. So let's, for the strength of this argument, assume that, there are no injuries. Everyone's operating at full strength, because there are some kind of questions that we can talk about, with some players on these teams and some players that are either coming back from injury and stuff. But let's talk about, hey, everyone's healthy, full unit. We've got everyone available. How do these guys all fit together? For me, the very first team that popped out to me in projections and ADP is the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, this is a team that had they were just mollywopped with the injuries last year. They never had anyone on the field together. Brandon Aiyuk, Deebo Samuel, Jauan, Jennings, Ricky Pearsall all missed multiple games. Also, Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle also missed multiple games as well. So we look at the top-down Shanahan system, not a system that runs a lot of three wide receiver sets. They've not been a huge 11 personnel team. They're actually 31st in 11 personnel under Kyle Shanahan since he joined the team. Gamers are looking at this right now, and they're not drafting any of these guys as starting wide receivers. Jauan Jennings is right in that cusp at wide receiver 36. You have Ricky Pearsall at wide receiver 41 and Brandon Aiyuk, coming off the knee injury at wide receiver 48. Everyone's healthy, Matt. How do these guys all fit together? Because I think at the end of the season is where you really want to look at this thing.
Right. And I think it's funny you brought this group up, because I've been actually working on Ricky Pearsall. He's somebody who I'm probably going to finish here tonight. He'll be on the May 12th drop for the year two guys on the site. And so 49ers were on the brain, but like I look at these ADPs and I do think like there is a significant value here. I'm convinced of that between Jennings, Pearsall, and Aiyuk. It's hard to pinpoint exactly which one is the right answer here. Assuming in this argument that, like, again, in our little fake scenario here, that everybody's healthy, I mean, let's just get this out of the way. Brandon Aiyuk in 2023 was one of the best wide receivers of the last 4 or 5 years. He had an incredible season from an efficiency standpoint. He had an incredible season from a reception perception standpoint. He's one of the best X receivers in the NFL. He fully deserved that $30 million contract that he signed. He obviously got injured, tore his ACL, multiple ligament injury in week 7, but his season was not going well before that because he missed an entire offseason of time, and he looked like it. He wasn't fully engaged with the process in terms of where he was in the route distributions and the route concepts and where he is in the read and the progressions and all that, because he was getting just slowly onboarded. Other than the spike week he had against the Cardinals, he was under 50 yards in every single game before tearing his ACL in week 7. It was just a nightmare start to the season. But if he's out there and he's healthy, I still have full confidence. Again, assuming health. I do understand that this is in our fake scenario. I have no hesitation in thinking he can get right back to being a number one receiver, a guy that they paid to start building the next phase of the offense around. And before I talk about Jennings and Pearsall, I think that's worth noting too. You talk about my position now among knowing wide receiver stuff. I think a lot of this has turned me into sort of okay, what are the players on the roster signaling to us? And I actually think that the Pearsall pick last year in the first round was a signal, but not the signal that many people thought it was. Like it really, when that pick happened, it was, oh, is Deebo going to get traded? Oh, is Brandon Aiyuk going to get traded? You know, maybe those conversations happened. Well, we all know those conversations happened, but to me, it actually was a bigger signal of what this offense became last year, Rich. And I think that's important to talk about. It's like, this was not the same, you know, Jimmy Garoppolo efficient play action stuff. And, you know, maybe some of it was because of the injury chaos, but I think they really tried and intended to move into more of a true drop back pass game with Brock Purdy under center, because Shanahan, you know, right or wrong, has all that faith in the world for Brock Purdy to be the guy to execute that style of offense. And frankly, I think they needed to move away from the Deebos, the gadget stuff, like all that little creative touch thing, and more into, again, like we've got 3 receivers on the field and we can dictate matchups here. And the signal was really coming even stronger after Ricky Pearsall, who got freaking shot in the preseason, missed multiple games to start the year because of that. They had him running like choice and whip routes from the slot in his first game back. And it wasn't great, you know, obviously from an on-film perspective, because he's coming off of a damn gunshot wound.
And
but by the end of this,
he had a hamstring.
And he had a hamstring injury. He had multiple things wrong with
it. He had quite eventful rookie season for Ricky Pearsall.
Not a smooth ride for old Ricky Pearsall, but man, by the end of the year, I thought he looked incredible. He was beating man coverage. He was, you know, really just that route runner that we expected to see with him as a prospect. So I'm actually pretty bullish on Pearsall going into year 2. And I think Jennings is a good player. I do think like Jennings checks a lot of the fantasy bro box in terms of like, oh, look at yards per route run and all these things. And I do think he's a quality player. But to me, I do think there's a value here between either Aiyuk or Pearsall. And honestly, maybe it could be a little bit of both. So I already thought this was a unit in transition prior to, like, it kind of in the middle of last year, maybe trying to live in both worlds. I think we see more of the fully fleshed version of a true drop back team this year. And I think it benefits at least one of these, maybe 2 of these receivers.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up about the 49ers, because one of the things that really stands out to me when analyzing the 49ers from a year ago, not just was obviously everything went wrong from an injury perspective, but they had all these other ancillary things that stemmed from those injuries as well. One, they ended up facing the hardest passing schedule in the NFL as well. That also didn't help things and help their cause. But it's funny that you bring up like them all working in unison, because the last time we saw Brock Purdy play was that Monday night game against the Lions. And that was a game where Deebo was available and Jennings was available, and Pearsall still went off, and they almost hang 40 points on the Lions, you know, in that game. And this is a team that definitely is going to score more points based on just one, they have our easiest schedule projected, and that's not everything. It's just like a cherry on top of things. But what I thought was really interesting about the 49ers and Brock Purdy in general was there's a big transition for how teams tried to defend the 49ers last year. And maybe you've caught on to this too with some of the film watching that you've done breaking down these wide receivers, is without Christian McCaffrey, teams then started to play coverage against the 49ers last year. Like it was the most he had, even with all their wide receiver injuries. It was by far only 49% of his dropbacks last year came with the middle of the field closed. You know, I rinse out the 2 high safeties, the single high safeties and stuff. His first 2 years in the NFL is 59.9% and 60.5%. So without McCaffrey, teams were like, we don't care about you exploiting us to Christian McCaffrey. We're going to drop back and play coverage. We're going to make, even with your wide receivers always in constant motion, we're going to make Brock Purdy beat us. And he largely was. You know, I mean, even in the vertical game, you know, he completed a league high, 58% of his passes on throws 10 or more yards downfield. The league rate was 48.5%. It's the inverse of what we saw with Tua and the Dolphins, right? We saw the teams say, hey, you have faster wide receivers than us. We're going to play coverage. And then the Dolphins couldn't run the ball because of their offensive line. And teams were like, oh, you also can't make us pay for paying coverage. Good luck, Tua. Good luck, Tyreek. And that's what happened to the Miami Dolphins in a nutshell last year. I mean, they just, all their explosive plays were sapped because they couldn't punish teams for playing coverage against them. Now with Christian McCaffrey coming back, now you have Ricky Pearsall in year 2. Hopefully, Brandon Aiyuk getting caught up. You have Jauan Jennings, and you said you removed some of that, your air quote Mickey Mouse stuff that Deebo Samuel is doing. Now the 49ers are going to be able to, if you want to come and devote another guy to the box now, you have to account for Christian McCaffrey. This passing game is just one I'm just generally excited about, because they're going to score points. All their question marks of winning NFL games, I still think surrounds all the the pieces they have moving on defense, this team's going to score points, especially when you give them an easy schedule on paper, no matter how easy it plays out or not. It's like the 49ers are a team that like I've just had like earmarked, like, wow, all these guys are undervalued right now in early drafts. I do want to talk about Jauan Jennings, though, specifically, because he not only does he have the highest ADP, how much do you think was him just being the glue guy? Because remember, after they drafted Pearsall, he got a 2-year deal. He got a 2-year extension. Everyone was like, what? You just drafted Ricky Pearsall. Like, what are you doing? And hey, shrewd move by the 49ers. But how much of was just him elevated? Because we saw in week 1, you talked about Aiyuk not being up to speed. He gets bumped up in week 1 initially. He's playing a little more X and rotating in more because Ayuk's not able to play 100% of the snaps. Then, we see the injuries, and he's just constantly moving around position to position, right? Ends up as the end of the season, kind of X guy with Aiyuk being out. Where do you see him slotting in? Is he going to now fall back? If this team does maybe, even if they increase 11 personnel, do you think he's still the odd man out in 2 wide receiver sets?
That's going to be the biggest question between him and Pearsall, because I do think I'm glad you brought up Jennings, because he is someone who was really part of that signal as well. I think that they were transitioning to more of a like drop back true passing game, like spread things out a little bit, because like he's just a good player who can play all 3 positions. Now, is he, one of these like a superstar at all 3 positions? I don't know about that, but he definitely showed last year that he can play on the outside. He's somebody I've always had an affinity for because he's tough, he blocks, he wins against man coverage on 3rd down. So it made sense. Like, oh yeah, he's popped up so much on these like 3rd down looks where you see more man coverage. Like, why not get that guy moving on the outside? And he's got longer arms than you think, and he's just more athletic than you think. So I do think he can play a little bit on the perimeter. He's someone that he will be the key in sort of determining, specifically determining like the upside for Ricky Pearsall, because Pearsall is, oh man, I mean, you were talking about how much like man coverage they faced. I think that was the thing. Like this is funny. Sometimes you see this when you're charting the games and everything. Like I was watching the week 15 game against the Rams and the week 16 game against the Dolphins. And the difference between what Pearsall was doing against man coverage in those 2 games versus what he was doing when we first saw him pop on the scene after some of the injuries, after the gunshot wound. It was just a night and day difference. And I have to imagine that going into that week 17 game against a defense in the Detroit Lions where you get so much more man coverage against them, that had to be a focus point. We've got to get Pearsall the ball because he is open on these plays against man coverage. And that's why they drafted him. That's why he was such a good prospect to me, because he's a slot receiver. He can play a little bit outside as well, because he just, again, obliterates man coverage. 6.45 yards per route run against man coverage in that week 17 game against the Lions. So I really want to be in on Pearsall. I kind of want to be bullish on him this year, but he is somebody who's certainly like, we've got to figure out what Jennings' role is, because I think Jennings can play slot. He can play flanker. I would imagine when they're in 11 personnel, it probably will be Pearsall slot, Aiyuk X, Jennings as the flanker. But I think we do have to acknowledge that even if we're saying like Brandon Aiyuk is healthy in this scenario, that might not be the case until, maybe midway through the season. So I do think all these guys are interesting at cost, but I want to be pretty high on Ricky Pearsall going into this year.
Yeah, those are the 2 guys I've kind of been gravitated towards too. One, we'll see, because I assume Ayuk's going to be a guy. I want to be drafting Aiyuk now, because if we get more positive like reports, he'll only climb. I always want to be, like we saw the pictures of him golfing with Brock Purdy this week, which has no transitive property to like playing NFL football. But like, if we continue to see like his trajectory might be earlier than expected, like he's just going to, that wide receiver 48 is going to then turn into wide receiver 42, then wide receiver 38, And because especially in these early drafts, because none of us are drafting season-long leagues now, it's only these degenerate best ball leagues. You're getting that priced in too, where like you get that early season replacement value already built in that format, where if he's now cooking down the stretch and he's playing close to 100% the final 7 weeks of the season, that's where you care about it the most, like at that price point, maybe having that. So I've been trying to draft Aiyuk early now, and then just year 2 wide receivers are kind of my siren song anyway. So definitely, go over to, the reception perception. Matt's going to be charting all of these guys. That's kind of his like immediate point of emphasis, correct? Like that's where you're shopping right now. And the next couple teams have year 2 wide receivers on them. The next team I want to talk about is another team that had just a litany of injuries, were not able to get their full unit on the field. So we have no idea really how all these guys are going to play together. and that is the Kansas City Chiefs. They ran absolutely 0 plays last year with Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, Marquise Brown on the field. As a default, they kind of had to revert back to the Travis Kelce as our wide receiver one in the offense, which didn't work as well because 35-year-old Travis Kelce has been a depreciating asset. And it's no fault of Travis Kelce. Like, listen, Father Time comes for us all, man. Like, 35-year-old tight end. It's hard to run your offense through that type of player, especially when he's not creating the yak that younger Travis Kelce was creating. And as default, the Chiefs only threw the ball to their wide receivers 49% of the time last year. It was 29th in the league. So Rashee Rice, he's already been posting like the demon workout videos, right? I think the only thing keeping him suppressed right now is people are worried about like the legal stuff. And if we have another offseason where it looks like it might be getting punted here, which Drew Davenport has already hinted at it could, he's another guy that I think climbs. But we saw Xavier Worthy come out at the end of last season, kind of playing the Rashee Rice role.
Right.
So how does it work now? Because that was also in Xavier Worthy's collegiate profile, where he kind of won more as like, ooh, how are these guys going to play together? Because Rashee Rice came out like gangbusters last year to open the year. Like, is that going to be the offense we see again? Or is there going to be more of a gel based on how Worthy played towards the end of the year? And Hollywood also is coming back. Like, talk about all these guys, how they fit together.
I think this is so difficult. Like whereas with the 49ers, it's so clean, like, okay, we're lining up in 11 personnel and Aiyuk is our X and Jennings and Pearsall are both kind of rotating between slot flanker. I mean, dude, I really have no idea with these 3 wide receivers because, I would guess that Hollywood's like your most likely perimeter option, but he doesn't really fit well in that role to me. I thought he was just kind of okay when he got back last year. He's just kind of settled into this is who he is as a player, which is not bad. Like it's a competent wide receiver that you can put on the field, but it's certainly not like a necessarily needle move or anything like that. I'm glad you brought that up about Worthy and Rashee Rice. Like that's where I can't really get like square with these guys is because Ricky Pearsall, God, I keep saying Ricky Pearsall. Rashee Rice comes onto the scene last year and is just smoking teams early in the season on these quick hitting slants, in breakers, stuff like that. And it's because of all the space that Worthy was creating for this team. Like Worthy was valuable right away from a tactical perspective because he was stretching teams out. And that just left Rashee Rice to just eat again and again and again. And he's really, really good with the ball in his hands. I don't necessarily think we saw, and look, it was only a few games. It wasn't that much. But I don't think we saw Rashee Rice take a step as like a perimeter receiver, as a man coverage beater. He has a 5.2 air yards per target mark last year. Like he's still mostly a big slot that you want to get quick hitting routes. He doesn't have to necessarily be a screen merchant or anything like that, but he's certainly not
all the mesh.
Yeah, all the mesh. And like these two guys can work in concert in that way, but they're both kind of players that I would say need role catering, Xavier Worthy and Rashee Rice. And that's just a lot to put on one offense when you've got 2 guys that need some role catering. Now, Worthy, I do think, took big steps in the back half of the year, and this will be reflected in his reception perception data as a man coverage beater. Definitely not a guy that you want to see pressed. He's not like a press coverage beater, but off man, things like that, he can certainly get rolling. But a lot of that, like you said, it was quick hitting stuff. And I'm just really interested to see like how these 2 guys fit together, because I feel like there can only be one fantasy winner here. If I had to guess, I think I trust Rashee Rice a little bit more than Xavier Worthy, but I'm kind of skeptical of both of these guys as individual talents being like, I don't think either one's like a true number 1 receiver. And that just makes them really difficult to project together.
Yeah, that's interesting because that might have some, dynasty value of being able to potentially like sell at their highest point, just if it's going to be, like you said, more cattywampus due to like the catering of roles. This is a team I think on the surface too, like we just have to project them for a lot more 11 personnel. They showed their hand when Hollywood came back last year, right? Like once Hollywood came back, in the games he was available, they were in 11 personnel just under 60% of the time. It was 45% before him. Again, some of this is just dictated by what you have available, right? Like we get caught up in some of the stuff. This will make the next team pretty interesting too when we talk about them. But then we saw like Noah Gray take that step back, in the offense by default because they just had better wide receivers and better perimeter players. But yeah, when I can't always go back to the Texas Xavier Worthy stuff, like him coming into the NFL, and I remember him drafting him because he was thought of as this the 4.21 speed, right? And that, like you said, it had a tactical advantage, but all his productive plays like at Texas were on like things near the line of scrimmage. And then we saw the back half of the year when he moved to the slot more. They started to give him more of those quick hitter targets that were opened up with just Rashee Rice not being available. And it's like, all right, are we going to pull that away now? Or is that something they just can't put back in the bottle? And it is really tough to diagnose. Whereas inversely, we say Worthy can, I think, just win on raw speed alone, like he did at the end of the Super Bowl, right? Like we at least know that exists in the range of outcomes. Whereas Rice, we don't know. And it's like that's kind of where I keep going back to trying to like put these guys together. It's like, man, what Rashee Rice is really good at might just be what he's really good at.
Right.
Where the Chiefs might look at it and say, like, all right, hey, we're not going to ask Xavier Worthy to run, 9 routes or like these deep posts. That's going to be Hollywood. That's going to be Worthy. And then by default, just Rashee Rice falls back into this 20, he falls into the lead target role, basically, is what I'm saying. So it's like that's kind of where I keep going back to. But they're a very tough team to diagnose because, again, it's Patrick Mahomes, right? Like he's had a couple down years for fantasy, but like it still is Patrick Mahomes. Like we know where the ceiling can get to. And we saw that a little bit, with like Joe Burrow last year too. Like that exists in the range of outcomes for Patrick Mahomes to still be that juggernaut. And could we have that hot Chiefs offense again?
Yeah, I just wish they had something resembling like normal receivers as the Bengals do. And then even like their most consequential receiver addition this year was probably Jalen Royals in the 4th round, who our mutual friend JJ Zacharias in his draft guide has a Rashee Rice comp for. And if you look at his reception perception profile, a lot of pre-draft, like before he lands at the Chiefs, I'm like, yeah, there's some merit to that Rashee Rice comp. He probably needs some roll catering. I think he actually would be really weaponized as a speed threat from the slot because he only runs like 2 routes on the perimeter and stuff like that. They added like Elijah Badger as a UDFA, who I thought was like an interesting X receiver, but I mean, he's a UDFA. So unless we're going to get the Justin Ross camp videos again, I don't really know like if this team has a normal wideout, which again makes, I want to be in on the Chiefs. And maybe this will just end up being a blind spot for me, but I just have a tough time projecting how these two guys win together.
And it goes further. I mean, McCole Hardman, Tyreek Hill, Sky Moore, like all these guys were guys that needed that. They have an archetype they definitely like.
And they still have Juju on the roster, man. And he is another one who was kind of like he was Rashee Rice before Rashee Rice. So they do have. Yeah, they have a weird. I just one perimeter like true big bodied X receiver would be nice, and it preferably not somebody on their last legs like DeAndre Hopkins.
Yeah, the next team that I definitely want to transition into with the great Matt Harmon, definitely go to reception perception. I could just kind of keep echoing that, like all the work that he's doing. You can see the level of detail he puts into all of this analysis of scouting these wide receivers. You actually had the tweet, I believe it was on draft day or shortly after the draft. I think you might have said, like, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there are going to be fantasy holy wars kind of fought over projecting the Chicago Bears offense this offseason. And, you're in those year 2 wide receivers. You're scouting Rome Odunze, a guy that, reception perception loved coming out. You're trying to get into DJ Moore and what happened to, his role last year. And we're all excited to say, like, all right, well, Ben Johnson's coming into town. He's going to, fix some of the mistakes that Shane Waldron, made. We're going to have a transition here. We could have, one of these guys and like potentially the DJ Moore could be in the Amon-Ra St. Brown role. He's had kind of some usage like that. You saw like the, how he was used early in his career in Carolina, and then could Rome Odunze get that Jameson Williams treatment where like back half of the year, Jameson Williams wasn't just a deep threat. He was getting he became kind of like a safer floor guy that could give you shot plays. Like, could that be Rome just because the usage was so dependent on like inefficient downfield targets? And then you have the Caleb Williams factor and you're like, all right, is all this going to fix? And then they come out during the draft. They draft a tight end at pick 10 in Colston Loveland, and they draft basically a slot-dependent player, and you might push back on that depending what reception said, but in Luther Burden, immediately in the top with another top 35 pick. So what are we doing? You said there's going to be Holy Wars fought. Where are you taking your first definitive stance here?
Yeah, the first definitive stance is that this is a little bit of a mess to talk through, and probably requires like an hour and a half to fully unpack everything. But yeah, no, I specifically said too that there's going to be wars fought in like dynasty fantasy football about these guys because, you've got your camp of people who are really high on Luther Burden because he was productive at a young age in college, and then you've got some people who just don't like him at all because he's got, the screen usage and sort of that kind of create a touch role, which some people just write off college prospects who do that. You've got Rome Odunze, who was, from a yards per route run standpoint, is in a range that you don't want as year one players. And there are definitely some dynasty gamers that will just completely write off players because of what they did from an efficiency perspective as a rookie. I'm not among them, obviously. Like I think yards per route run and all these stuff, like targets per route run, they're all good stats, but I think it would be insane to not acknowledge that they're impacted by environments and your surrounding teammates. Like that should not be a controversial opinion. And just really, there was a lot of issues in this wide receiver room last year. And I mean like politics issues, like things beyond just how guys were playing, because Keenan Allen was there. Like you got two former Pro Bowl receivers in DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. And one guy is obviously not happy with what's going on. And that was DJ Moore. That's not a secret. That was visible from the very beginning. And I think Luther Burden being added to the mix here, Ben Johnson is like sent a shot across the bow at his own players, like in the post game press conference, basically saying, or post draft press conference saying, yeah, we sent a message, or we turned up the notch a little bit on certain people. I don't think it takes a detective to find out who certain people are when you're watching the 2024 Chicago Bears. But specifically on Rome Odunze, like I thought he actually played really well in isolation. 72.2% success rate versus man, 78.9% success rate versus press. I think it's a guy who can play all three receiver positions. I don't think this will be I don't think there will be an Amon-Ra St. Brown role or a Jameson Williams role, because I think those guys are so fundamentally different from both of these top two receivers and also from Luther Burden as well. Like I think Luther Burden can do some slot receiver stuff. I think DJ Moore can do some slot receiver stuff. I think Rome Odunze can do some slot receiver stuff. So I imagine all three of these guys will rotate a little bit. Like Burden might need a little bit to get up to speed, although I don't think he's just a pure slot player. I actually think his best routes came more so against man coverage than zone coverage. He faced more zone coverage than almost any other prospect I've ever charted at the collegiate level, and had a sub 80% success rate. Like for all that zone coverage, you'd imagine you'd want him to be higher than that from a reception perception standpoint. But I actually think his route running against zone showed like a real lack of feel and all of that. But when you just got him on like ISO man coverage situations, he almost kind of had some Bud Light Malik Neighbors to him, which really makes me still want to buy into that like ceiling of Luther Burden, even though I kind of come down in the middle on him as a prospect. But I'm really still bullish on Rome Odunze. I thought he's a great prospect. I thought his year one film was very good. It just was a bit of a victim of circumstance, both from how crowded it was and also just the chaos environment overall there in Chicago. So I really do think if Caleb Williams can play, like all these guys can work, but Odunze is the guy I've kind of been more bullish on so far.
Yeah, and I mean that's the missing, like the greatest question of all is the Caleb Williams factor, because so much of Caleb Williams' problems like got pushed to the Shane Waldron and then Thomas Brown offense, but there's a lot of stuff underneath the hood that looks like Caleb Williams problems that he also had in college, and you just hope that there's enough existing talent where like he can overcome some of those things like early in his career. And obviously you were going to have runway in year two, and we've got the Ben Johnson steam going on. I'm glad that you brought that up about Luther Burden. I harped the same things during the process that I actually thought he won downfield a lot more than he was given credit for, and that he was actually not that good of an intermediate player. And, that's where I thought like, it's like, all right, well, he might end up just being a guy that I thought that's why there was such a clear difference in why he lived on either getting a vertical target, beating the defense over the top, or having to have the manufactured stuff, because the nuanced stuff was where he struggled. And that's what's interesting to see his development, because I think how well Luther Burden plays in year one kind of dictates how this train goes, because of the Loveland pick. And obviously, you take Loveland pick 10, there's a clear plan for him, and you still have Cole Kmet on board, and we'll see, like, Cole Kmet's still a young player, only 26 years old. Cole Kmet's gonna be one of those guys like, wait, still only 26 years old. We'll just keep doing that game with him, like wherever he goes next. But if Loveland is a guy that plays well, and Burden's a guy that plays well, like seeing how these dominoes like fit together, it's gonna be interesting, because that's gonna kind of dictate like how much 11 versus 12 do we get. Because Ben Johnson is another one of these guys that, if you just are using the Detroit stuff, it's like, man, they did play a lot of 12, and that was with Brock Wright and like,
Right.
but being the second, like Cole Kmet's a better talent than Brock Wright and can contribute in the run game. And then you have Loveland, kind of as your Laporta. It's like, so how much do we even see 3 wide receiver sets with the Bears? There's like kind of all these things that kind of diagnose. But I look at Odunze and like just the way he was forced to like live from like a fantasy asset. And there's just like no way he's going to be used like that way again. I mean, he was basically used the exact same capacity that like the way the Titans used Calvin Ridley last year. Like, just forced to live on like these inefficient, like downfield targets because the intermediates, like the immediate stuff was all occupied by those veteran guys. I'm the guy that I think is the most curious is DJ Moore, not just from like a mercurial state of like, is his head in the game, but how does he get used? Because he then like his usage fell apart last year when they made the change to Thomas Brown. Like Thomas Brown was just like, we're just going to throw screens to you. And like, that's what we're going to do. And like, that's all of his game was last year. Yep. And like, so it's like, yeah, the Bears are definitely one of these teams. Like, I mean, DJ Moore, we're starting to see the ADP dip a little bit, but the other guys are all like pretty palatable. I think where you just want to take some nibbles here and kind of see what you get.
And it's funny with DJ Moore too. It felt like hey, we're just going to throw you screens to like get you engaged and like,
yes,
we're trying to make you happy. But it's funny. I spoke to both these guys, Odunze and DJ Moore at the Super Bowl this year. And, I was talking to, sorry. But I was talking to DJ cause I'm going to do it again, but we've spoken, over the years. And, I kind of mentioned to him, like, it feels like it's been a while since we've had an offense that has like put you in space. Like we saw in your rookie year and like early in Carolina, they were really, really good at that. Kind of like, asking him what, a little bit like, what's the deal with that? Like, is that do you want more opportunities to do that? Because when I asked Rome, like what stands out about DJ's game, it was, just how good he is with the ball in his hands, how well he diagnoses things and stuff like that. And yeah, DJ's kind of point was, well, it does come down to scheme and it comes down to coach. He's like, and it's funny you mentioned the screen thing. I didn't think about this until now, but one of his points was, it's one thing when you get into the open field and there's, you got a lot of blockers, like you can have a lot of confidence there. But when I'm 90% sure he literally said, but when you're just getting like a bunch of screens and it's just you and like the defender in front of you, it's just, you don't have a lot of confidence in that. It's like, I don't think he was confident in a lot of what was going on last year from a variety of angles. So yeah, he is definitely the one that, like, I think if he comes in here and he works really hard and he's just engaged with this new coaching staff, like he can really hit big because we know he's a good player. We've seen him be a good player in the NFL before. We've seen him be a productive player in the NFL before, where as much as I like Odunze, we haven't seen that. And obviously Luther Burden's a rookie. So Moore is kind of a central figure here. And he is somebody I think that if you do want to do the Amon-Ra St. Brown role or the Jameson Williams role, you can kind of think like he can do a little bit of both of those things or really specialize in one or the other. So I've always been a big fan of DJ Moore's game. And I think last year what happened was really unfortunate and it's kind of tarnishing where he is right now, but I'm hoping that we can find like the right type of role for him because certainly there's a good player in there. And ironically enough, Rich, I think actually if you were to do a ceiling comparison for Luther Burden, like it would be DJ Moore. So like there's a lot of pressure, I think, on DJ Moore right now in terms of just what's going on in that building.
Yeah, I love that. Once again with Matt Harmon from Reception Perception, I've got one wild card team for you, and then I've got one specific player I want to get your take on. One wild card team here that because people like the quarterback, right? Like if you look up like anyone's like sleepers, so like quarterbacks that like they're investing in or guys they want to draft, Drake May consistently pops up. Like, and some of that is because of some of the rushing stuff that we saw with him when he started, but
of course.
Sneakily, like the Patriots have kind of revamped this wide receiver unit. I mean, Drake May had some production as an actual passer too, like throwing to Kayshon Boutte and DeMario Douglas, and like they were rotating dudes in like Kendrick Bourne, who obviously maybe have been the original Jauan Jennings, but they never could get Jalen Polk on the field. They never could get Javon Baker on the field. They go out, they get Stefon Diggs, is a free agent contract. They do their homework on Stefon Diggs. They say, hey, we do want to pay him and bring him here. They come into the draft and they get Kyle Williams. I also would say they get Travion Henderson too. Who doesn't fall in, the reception perception profile, but a guy that changes the fabric of your passing game as well. And then people are losing sight too. Like Josh McDaniels is back. And I know Josh McDaniels, the head coach, is kind of a donkey, but there's a reason he kept getting to fail as a head coach. And because he can coach some offense, man. Like,
Yeah.
even that last year we saw him in full at the Raiders, like they were 8th in yards per play, like way overpunched that roster. I go to that last year that they had Cam Newton, the Patriots, like the ghost of Cam Newton, and like he squeezed everything they could out of that offense. Like, so like Drake May's getting all these upgrades, but no one's drafting any of the pass catchers. So, like, where are we at with Stefon Diggs? You know, again, we're assuming health, like when Diggs is healthy, you know, we're assuming he's going to be healthy at some point. And then, you know, Kyle Williams being a guy that you charted for the reception perception and a guy that got steam and then had the draft capital to back up some of that steam. And then, you know, they still have DeMario Douglas, a very, you know, fine player in his role. But, you know, what kind of, you know, potential upside could we have in this offense that maybe gamers aren't accounting for?
Yeah, let's talk about Diggs and Williams first, and I do want to talk about like kind of the rest of the collection of players here because that's where it gets interesting. But Diggs, I think it's sort of being framed with him that yeah, he transitioned into a slot receiver last year because like it was time for him to be that. I kind of disagree with that. Like, I don't think he is the same vertical player. You've seen a consistent drop off in terms of his vertical route success rates and reception perception since his final year in Buffalo. That continued in his first year in Houston. I agree. Like, he can't be your vertical number one receiver anymore. But I think he was actually still really good against man coverage last year. 67th percentile success rate versus man, over 70% success rate. Like, that's still really good, over 70% against press. Like, this can definitely be your flanker. He does not have to play in the slot last year. That was just very much contextually what Houston was looking for because they tried to trade for Keenan Allen before they traded for Stefon Diggs. Like, they were looking for a slot receiver, which makes sense because they had two perimeter players, a true X and Nico Collins, an elite number one X receiver. And then they had like this vertical screamer in Tank Dell, who really was never healthy last year. I don't really know why they just assumed that would be the case because Diggs and him probably could have worked a little bit more in tandem if Diggs was used more on the outside. But again, I don't think Diggs has to be a slot receiver here. I think he can be their flanker. Williams is really interesting because I just thought he was a fantastic prospect. I thought he was a priority round 2 ranked player to me. He's the type of receiver. I tried to not get like too high on Kyle Williams because he's the type of receiver I've maybe over-indexed myself on over the years. Like a true separator, a guy who can win really well on those quick routes. But what makes him interesting, especially from a fantasy perspective, Rich, is that he is not just one of these like, oh yeah, he's a route runner. He's not, Elijah Moore. He's not like Jahan Dotson. Again, like guys that I've been maybe Jaden Reed, like over-indexed on these guys in the past. He's awesome with the ball in his hands. I mean, you could flip him like screens, you could flip him quick routes, and he makes plays in the open field. You obviously have to ask like level of competition questions and things of that nature, but he mostly played X receiver for college last year. Like, he was a guy that won against press coverage, 82nd percentile success rate versus press. I'm not saying he's going to be an X receiver in the NFL at his size, but I do think he could be a really good outside receiver. So I think you got two guys in Diggs and Williams who actually kind of have maybe overlapping skill sets a little bit. I actually think like if Kyle Williams hits, he probably could become a Stefon Diggs player. So I'm confident those guys can hold outside receiver roles, maybe not at the same time. Maybe it's year 2 for Williams and Diggs is the guy this year. But I think there can be ways in which you use them together on the field. I'm bullish on those two guys. And I think the fact that both those guys beat man coverage, that's a huge upgrade from what the Patriots had last year.
Yeah, Diggs is interesting because the slot stuff started out that way, but then once again for the second year in a row, like the Texans, wide receiver room was thrown like a turnstile because Dell started to miss time and then Nico Collins missed time. And then when Diggs got to play more outside during those weeks, we saw him kind of, he wasn't like early career Diggs, but he was a productive player. He actually averaged almost a full yard per route run over out playing outside than he did in the slot last year.
Yeah.
Obviously some of that was like the low A dot stuff, but he showed he could win outside still too. Now you add the ACL and the age and stuff, and that is all going to be priced in. But I don't think he's necessarily going to be asked to be like to carry like the 30% target share. I think some gamers were initially thinking like we might saw remember like when Adam Thielen was like a dust ball and went to his like last year in Minnesota and went to Carolina and everyone was like, man, we're done. But he's going to get so many targets. Like, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen with Diggs because they did improve like the overall core of the unit. And you said you wanted to talk about some of these other guys. Listen, you're going to do the year 2 charting. You don't got much to watch on Baker and Polk. Like them dudes weren't on the field. So like but that was the same case with Butte in year 1. Like he also wasn't on the field in year 1, and then they threw him out there last year.
Oh, dude, he was like on the roster bubble in training camp, and then freaking Tyquan Thornton, who is of course a Kansas City Chief because he's small and fast. Now, yeah, they got to type. Tyquan Thornton was the starting X receiver over Kayshon Boutte at a training camp, and that quickly they scrapped that experiment. And then Kayshon Boutte was playing X receiver for this team. I think he ended up running the most routes on the team in last season. But yeah, Baker will definitely not make the site because there's obviously not enough routes there. Jalen Polk, even if he doesn't make this drop, just because there's a lot of year 2 players to get through, he'll be on the site at some point because I already did 4 games of his for the in-season rookie report, and my takeaway from there was, look, there's no question he dropped his opportunity, quite literally dropped his opportunities. He didn't make the most of it. Which was crazy, Rich, because I didn't love Polk as a prospect, but I did like him, and I thought and I'm not alone in this. The front office thought this too. Elliot Wolf, the de facto GM, said this. They thought he would be an instant impact player because he could block really well and he had great hands in college. Well, he couldn't catch a damn thing last year and he couldn't block either, which was just very befuddling, and I think does probably speak to some coaching issues. And more to that, they threw him out there as an X receiver at times last year. And as much as I liked Polk, he never played X at Washington. There was nothing in his profile that indicated, he could play X receiver. He was mostly like, again, I don't want to call him like a Puka Nacua type player, but that's the sort of usage that they gave him at Washington, where it's a lot of in-breakers, off the line of scrimmage, things like that. So to me, I don't know if he can recover from a disastrous rookie year like the one that he had. But if it does, it will be as a kind of like, not necessarily like a big slot fully, but a guy who's mostly off the line of scrimmage and does play some slot receiver. Pop Douglas is a guy who is a better man than zone beater, which is always weird for a slot receiver. And then, Kendrick Bourne, like, you could tell me that there's a scenario where if there are injuries here, he actually leads the team in receiving yards, or you could tell me there's a scenario where he doesn't make the roster. So that's just like, and then obviously Javon Baker is a total wild card as well, but might be the best like theoretical X receiver fit on this roster right now. So very weird group in New England, but I do think it's worth keeping tabs on the non-Diggs and Williams guide, just because because I do think there's some interest there.
I love it. Yeah. Patriots fan. Like, who knew we'd be talking some Patriots wide receivers, but I absolutely am I'm the camp that it's into Kyle Williams, and especially where you can draft him right now. Why not? Right. If he's bad, whatever. That's kind of my thought. Like he's just a player that I think for his upside has just tremendous price, because you have the contingency stuff, right? Like that's not even being priced in. Like, what if Diggs is never fully back? Right. Like all of those things.
And he's so good, man. He was just a great prospect to me. Like, the film was awesome at last year. I think he's a really good player. So he's definitely somebody like in rookie drafts. I definitely in one league, he went on a certain site. He is like very, very underranked, but I was drafting with a lot of people who, know who Kyle Williams is. And this is probably a stupid thing, but I was picking 2.8. The person ahead of me was 2.7. They took Kyle Williams. I was like, what do I have to do to move one spot here, and like you take 2.8 and I get 2.7 and Kyle Williams, and it ended up devolving into like a 3-person trade. So I'm doing the thing which you shouldn't do. I was getting fixated on one guy, and I was very fixated on Kyle Williams. But like I said, very big fan of the player.
Yeah, so sometimes that works against you when you go to play. I mean, I know even in my home leagues, like my buddies are like, dude, I was reading all the stuff you're putting out off season. You try to sneak a guy through an auction. They're like, nah, man, it's not going to happen. I love it. That hopefully that provides some clarity on some of the tougher, wide receiver, rooms that post draft. But I think it's always fun to talk about that, especially with a guy like you, who's always looking at like the way these guys are used, the way they win, which I think is important.